The dining room smelled of roasted chicken and rosemary bread, a meal I had always prepared for birthdays. A few neighbors sat at the table, chatting politely, while my grandchildren had already slipped into the living room, their faces glowing in the light of their phones. I smoothed the tablecloth, trying to ignore the empty chair where my late husband once sat. Marbelle arrived last, her heels clicking against the hardwood. She wore a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and carried a plastic grocery bag, the kind you never expect to see at a birthday celebration. "I brought you something special, Mom," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. I reached for the bag, still hoping for something kind, maybe a scarf, or even just a card. Inside was an old broom, its bristles splayed and its handle chipped from years of use. Marbelle held it high, as if she had chosen it with care. "Now you can fly, Mom," she announced. The room went still. Neighbors shifted in their chairs. One cleared his throat, another lowered her gaze. My grandson tucked his phone under the table, unwilling to look at me. For a moment, my hands trembled, but I pressed my fingers tight against the handle. Steadying myself, I thought of every night I had worked late, every bill I had covered, every sacrifice folded quietly into this home. None of that mattered in this moment. All that was left was the laughter that never came, the silence pressing against the walls. I lifted my head, met her eyes, and said simply, "Thank you." My voice did not break. I set the broom beside me on the floor, a strange kind of trophy, and began cutting the cake. After the guests left, and the laughter that never belonged faded into the night, I sat at the table with the broom leaning against the wall. The silence of the house felt heavier than the voices that had filled it hours before. My thoughts drifted back, as they often did, to the house in Springfield where my husband and I had built our life. It was a modest place, with clapboard siding that needed paint every other year, but it was ours. When he passed, I told myself I would hold on to it forever. But then Marbelle and her husband began speaking about their growing family, how the children needed more space, how the schools here in Eugene would be better. I listened, and eventually I agreed. I sold the house, took every dollar of my savings, and poured it into this bigger place, so they would never have to worry about shelter. 2 years have passed since then. 2 years of bills in my name, leaky pipes fixed by my hands, and property taxes covered without a word of thanks. I kept the receipts tucked neatly in a folder, not to use against anyone, but to remind myself that sacrifice had form and weight. At first, I thought respect would grow naturally, that Marbelle would recognize the roof above her head was steadied by the foundation of my years. Instead, I watched as she grew more distant, her words sharper, her laughter cutting at my presence. I became the extra chair in the corner, the voice no one consulted, the guest in the house I had paid for. The broom stood as proof not of what she gave, but of what she believed I was worth. And as I cleared the dishes that night, I knew the silence I had bought with my sacrifices was over. It was time to reach for the folder I had never opened in front of her. That night, I carried the broom upstairs, not as a relic, but as a reminder, and set it beside my lockbox. The metal box had been gathering dust under my bed for 2 years, holding the quiet truth I had almost forgotten. I pulled it onto the quilt, turned the key, and lifted the lid. Inside lay the purchase documents for this house. I had insisted on setting up a small LLC in my name when I sold the Springfield place. The lawyer back then had asked why, and I told him it was for organization. The truth was simpler. I had spent a lifetime watching how easily power slipped away from women when they trusted blindly. I wasn't going to let my sacrifice dissolve into someone else's signature. I flipped through the pages, my hands steady now. There it was in black and white, an addendum I had asked for. Marbelle and her husband were listed as occupants. not owners. They were required to contribute monthly toward household expenses, and if they failed, the LLC retained the right to revoke occupancy. It was a clause most people would have laughed at, but I had insisted. Tonight, it no longer felt like paranoia. It felt like foresight.
The next morning, while the house was still hushed, I called Mr. Redmond, my attorney in Portland. His voice hadn't changed, calm and clipped, as though time had only sharpened his precision. I read him the clause. "It holds," he said. "They haven't paid consistently, have they?" "No," I answered. The word came out more certain than I expected. "Then you are well within your rights, Evelina. You decide whether to enforce it." I thanked him, hung up, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folder. For 2 years, I had been living as though I were the guest, but here was the truth. I was the one who had given them shelter, and I was the one who could take it away. I closed the folder, placed it beside the broom, and began planning what would come next. Morning light stretched across the kitchen as I set out plates for breakfast. The smell of coffee filled the room, steadying me. Marbelle strolled in, her hair still pinned from the night before. A grin was already forming on her lips. "Mom, you really didn't think I meant anything with that broom, did you?" she asked, pouring herself coffee without offering me any. "It was just a joke. Everyone thought it was funny." I let her words settle in the air. Instead of answering, I reached for the broom, leaning against the wall, and set it gently on the table beside the folder of documents. The contrast made me almost smile, one a symbol of mockery, the other of authority she never imagined I possessed. Her eyes flicked to the folder, but she dismissed it with a shrug, stirring sugar into her cup. "You always take things too seriously." I didn't argue. Arguments had always ended with me retreating, her voice drowning out mine. This time, I chose silence, not the silence of surrender, but of calculation. When she left the kitchen, I opened the folder and culled out the pages I had marked the night before. I laid them flat, smoothed their edges, and snapped photographs, every clause, every signature. My hands didn't shake. They moved with the steadiness of someone who had already lived through years of storms. By mid-morning, I had scanned the copies at the library on 11th Avenue and tucked the originals back into the lockbox. On the walk home, the cool Oregon air filled my lungs. I wasn't rushing. I was preparing. Back in the kitchen, I dialed Mr. Redmond's office and arranged a meeting for the end of the week. The secretary confirmed, and I slid the appointment card into the folder. The broom stayed where it was, propped against the table leg, as if waiting for its part in the story, yet to be written. 2 mornings later, I found Marbelle in the living room, scrolling through her phone. One leg was draped over the arm of the chair, as if she owned every inch of the place. I held the envelope in my hand, the pages inside crisp, my name in bold at the top of the letterhead. "Marbelle," I said, my voice steady, "this is for you." She looked up, a half smile already forming. "What now, Mom? Another lecture?" She tore the envelope open carelessly, pulling the pages free. Her eyes skimmed the first lines. Then she let out a laugh sharp enough to sting. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, waving the notice in the air. 30 days to vacate? What is this? Some kind of stunt? I didn't flinch. I simply watched as her eyes, once bright with mockery, drifted lower down the page, her laugh caught in her throat. She reread the letterhead, her gaze stopping on the clause about failure to contribute, the signature of Mr. Redmond, and the seal of the LLC. Her color changed. "This isn't you, Mom. You wouldn't." "I would," I said quietly.
The silence that followed was short-lived. She shot to her feet, her voice rising. "You can't throw your own daughter out like a tenant. People will think you've lost your mind." The front door creaked open just then.
Mrs. Callahan from next door stepped onto her porch, watering can in hand, glancing over at the sound of Maribel's voice. Inside, my grandson paused on the staircase, wide-eyed. I knew the walls of this house were thin. Soon the whole street would know. I met Maribel's fury with calm. This is not about throwing anyone out. It's about respect. You have 30 days to decide. Contribute and honor this home, or find another. Her lips trembled, torn between another retort and the weight of the words on the page. She crumpled the notice in her fist, but I could see in her eyes that the truth had settled. The mockery was gone, replaced by something closer to fear. I gathered the remaining envelopes, slid them back into the folder, and left her standing in the living room as the broom leaned quietly against the wall. By the next afternoon, the phone began to ring, one call after another. Word travels quickly in families, even across state lines. My sister in Sacramento was the first, her voice heavy with disapproval. "Evina, she's your daughter. Families argue, but you don't serve papers on your own blood. Just forgive and forget." I listened, letting her spill her rehearsed phrases, the ones she had probably traded with cousins before dialing. When she finally paused, I spoke slowly. "Forgiveness is not free, Clara. I have given it away for years, and all it bought me was ridicule in my own home." An hour later, it was my cousin Ernesto from Fresno, pleading in the same tone. "She's proud, yes, but she'll come around. Don't make it worse by pushing her out." They all said the same thing in different words. Bend, retreat, endure. I sat at the kitchen table with the broom leaning against the wall and the folder of documents open beside me. And I realized how clearly I saw them now. Not as advisors, but as people more comfortable with silence than with change. That evening, Maribel stormed into the kitchen, waving her phone. "You've turned the whole family against me," she accused. "No," I answered. "Your actions have done that. I've simply stopped covering them." She glared, waiting for me to yield, but I had already decided. "There is one path forward," I said. "You put in writing what you did, you apologize to me and to the children, and we draw up a new lease. Shared costs, shared respect. Otherwise, the 30 days stand." Her mouth opened, but no words came. She turned and left, the sound of her footsteps echoing down the hall. I closed the folder, feeling the weight of both past and future settle in my chest, and prepared myself for the next storm. The following week, I heard the scrape of boxes across the hardwood. Maribel had pulled them from the garage and was tossing clothes into them with hurried, angry motions. Cupboard doors slammed, dresser drawers rattled. The sound carried through the walls like thunder in a storm. Each thud declared her defiance. I didn't interfere. I folded laundry in the back room and waited. Anger has a way of burning itself down to ashes, and I knew she would eventually reach them. Sure enough, as dusk fell, the noise shifted. Instead of slamming, I heard the soft crinkle of tissue paper, the creak of packing tape drawn slowly. When I passed the doorway, I caught sight of her shoulders bent forward, tears streaking her face as she placed framed photos into a box with careful hands. I carried on with my own work. In the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, I placed a smaller box, lined with felt. Across the lid, I wrote in black ink, "Mother, not maid." Then I retrieved the broom from where it had leaned for days, its bristles still frayed, its handle rough. I set it inside, closed the lid, and pressed my palm against the wood. It wasn't an object anymore. It was a reminder that I had finally chosen to define myself. In the kitchen, I cleared a space on the wall. From a drawer, I pulled a brass key that I had had engraved years ago, almost forgotten, in a keepsake box. On the head, it read, "Boundaries." I hung it on a small hook beside the pantry, where it caught the light every time I passed. Later, I walked past Maribel's room again. She looked up at me, eyes swollen, words caught in her throat.
For the first time in years, I didn't rush to comfort her. I simply nodded, acknowledging both her pain and my resolve. She turned back to her boxes, and I returned to the kitchen, letting the key glint quietly above my shoulder. The next morning, the house felt different, half packed, half claimed, and I knew it was my turn to shape what came next. Once the boxes were stacked next to the front door, the air in the house shifted. The tension that had knotted itself into every corner began to loosen. I walked through the rooms with deliberate steps, touching walls and windows as though they were being given back to me. The first change I made was in the hallway. I took the family photographs that Maribel had once pushed into a drawer and rehung them on the wall. My husband's smile, my son's gap-toothed grin, my grandchildren as babies all lined the corridor again. It felt like stitching back a piece of my own skin. In the backyard, I knelt by the beds that had gone dry under neglect. I pressed new seeds of cilantro and thyme into the soil, watered the rosemary that had somehow survived, and breathed in the earth. My hands smelled of green life, and I carried that scent with me back into the kitchen. That evening, I cooked for myself alone, a skillet of onions, peppers, and a slice of salmon that I had bought without anyone's disapproval about cost or smell. I ate slowly, without apology, savoring each bite in the quiet. But I also knew peace needed more than herbs and pictures. At the table, I opened a fresh notebook and began drafting instructions for my will. My grandchildren would always have my support, college funds, a share of savings, but I made clear that access depended on respect. I wrote the words carefully. Love was unconditional, but inheritance was not. When I finished, I folded the pages into the folder that already held the deed and the lease. I glanced at the brass key on the wall, gleaming faintly in the evening light. The silence around me was no longer empty. It was the sound of my own life returned. The house was mine again, and I intended to protect it.
A week after the house quieted, the mail slipped through the slot and landed on the floor. Among the bills and circulars was an envelope addressed in Maribel's handwriting. I held it for a long while before opening, tracing the uneven strokes of her pen. Inside was a folded sheet of stationery, the kind she used only on rare occasions. Her words began plainly. "Mom, I was wrong." She listed them one by one, the broom at the party, the comments whispered to neighbors, the meals she had mocked, the way she'd shut me out of decisions in the very home I had built. There were no excuses tucked between her sentences, no deflections, only the bare weight of recognition. I read it twice, then a third time. My eyes blurred, though not with tears. The letter did not erase the nights I had lain awake, but it acknowledged them, named them. That was something I had thought I would never receive. Still, I folded the page slowly and set it beside the brass key on the wall. Regret written on paper was a start, not an end. If Maribel wanted the door to reopen, she would need to repair what mattered most. That evening, I wrote my reply in neat lines. I told her the truth, that I had read her apology and accepted her words. But words alone could not teach the next generation. She must tell her children out loud that it was wrong to treat their grandmother as she had. She must show them respect by admitting her fault. I sealed the envelope and placed it by the door for the morning post, knowing my condition would reach her soon. We met on a gray Sunday afternoon in the church hall off Pearl Street, the kind of place where folding chairs carried more history than pews. A mediator from the congregation sat with us, a steady presence between mother and daughter. Maribel's voice was softer than I remembered. She admitted to the mediator what she had written in her letter,
that the broom was not a joke, that the barbed remarks had been intentional, that she had excluded me to claim control. Her shoulders bent under the weight of her own confession. I laid my terms out simply: shared costs divided clearly each month, house rules written and signed covering chores, bills, and privacy, and above all, mutual respect spoken in front of her children so they would learn from truth, not silence. She nodded, slowly, eyes glistening, and agreed. It was not triumph I felt, but a calm release, as though I had finally shifted the burden from my chest onto the table where it belonged. When I returned home, I placed the signed papers into the same folder that had once held only leverage. Upstairs, the cedar box marked Mother, Not Maid remained shut, the broom tucked away as a reminder. In the kitchen, the brass key engraved with boundaries still hung on its hook, gleaming whenever sunlight crossed it. I walked through the rooms that night, not as a guest, not as an intruder, but as a woman who had reclaimed her place. Peace was not forgetting what had happened. Peace was protecting what must never be lost again.